The morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of London as Patricia Winters adjusted her designer sunglasses. She was a 45-year-old real estate agent from Florida who believed the world should bend to her wishes. After all, she had spent exactly $12,457 on this luxury European vacation package, a fact she mentioned to anyone who would listen. Standing outside her expensive hotel near Buckingham Palace, Patricia checked her reflection in a store window. Her highlighted blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her branded clothes showed everyone that she was someone important. At least in her mind. She had planned this day for months, determined to get the perfect selfie with the royal guards to show off to her Facebook friends back home. Martha will be so jealous when she sees these photos, Patricia thought to herself, remembering her rival from the real estate office. She pulled out her new iPhone 15 Pro Max and practiced her selfie poses, causing several passing locals to roll their eyes. The walk to Buckingham Palace took about 15 minutes, but Patricia complained the whole way. She muttered about how the London sidewalks were too narrow, how the weather wasn't perfect enough, and how the British didn't know how to make a proper cup of coffee. When she arrived at the palace gates, she saw something that made her blood boil: a long line of tourists waiting to take photos. "Excuse me, coming through," she announced loudly, pushing past an elderly Japanese couple and their grandchildren. In her mind, her expensive vacation package meant she didn't have to wait in line like regular tourists. Several people protested as she shoved her way forward, but Patricia pretended not to hear them. The palace grounds were already busy that Tuesday morning. Tour groups from different countries gathered around their guides, families with excited children pointed at the magnificent building, and couples took romantic photos together. Everyone seemed to be following the clearly posted rules. Everyone except Patricia. She noticed the royal guard standing at his post, tall and proud in his traditional red uniform and bearskin hat. Private James Matthews had been serving as a royal guard for 2 years, and he had seen all types of tourists. But something about Patricia's attitude caught his attention right away. The first warning sign came when Patricia ducked under the rope barrier to get closer to the guard. A nearby palace staff member blew his whistle and pointed to the sign that clearly said, "Do not cross." Patricia rolled her eyes and stepped back, but she wasn't done yet. "These rules are ridiculous," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear her. "Do you know how much I paid to be here? This is supposed to be a first-class experience." Her voice carried across the courtyard, causing other tourists to stare at her in disapproval. Patricia then pulled out her selfie stick, another item that was clearly prohibited according to the signs. When another tourist politely pointed this out, she snapped back. "Mind your own business. I'm an American citizen, and I have rights." Her behavior was getting worse by the minute. She tried to position herself for the perfect selfie, stepping over the barrier for the second time. Private Matthews had to issue another warning, this time using his commanding voice that was reserved for such situations. The growing crowd watched as Patricia's face turned red with anger. In her world back in Florida, she was used to getting her way by demanding to speak to managers and making scenes at restaurants. But here, at Buckingham Palace, her usual tactics weren't working. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded, waving her expensive phone around. "I sell million-dollar homes in Palm Beach. I'm not some regular tourist." Her voice was getting louder, and more people were gathering to watch the scene unfold. Private Matthews remained perfectly still, as his training required. But his eyes tracked Patricia's increasingly erratic movements. She was now pacing back and forth, complaining about British customer service and how this would affect London's tourism industry. Little did Patricia know that her next action would not only ruin her expensive vacation, but would also make her infamous on social media across the world. As the morning sun continued to shine on the palace grounds, tension built in the air. The other tourists could sense that something was about to happen, something that would turn this ordinary Tuesday morning into an unforgettable incident at one of Britain's most famous landmarks. Private James Matthews had seen many difficult tourists during his 2 years as a royal guard, but something about Patricia Winters was different. As he stood at his post, maintaining his famous straight face, he could sense that this situation was about to become memorable, and not in a good way. The crowd around Patricia had grown larger now. Many tourists had stopped taking their own photos and were instead recording her behavior on their phones. Some were live streaming the scene on TikTok and Instagram, knowing that something dramatic was about to happen. I demand to speak to whoever's in charge here, Patricia shouted, her face getting redder by the minute. She pulled out a small fan from her expensive handbag and started waving it dramatically. The morning was hardly hot, but she was working herself into such a state that she was sweating. A young palace staff member named Sarah Thompson approached Patricia carefully. Sarah had dealt with angry tourists before, but she could tell this was going to be challenging. "Ma'am," she said politely, "I can help you if you'd like to step back behind the barrier." Patricia turned to Sarah with a look that could freeze water. "Finally, someone who actually works here," she said loudly. "Do you know how much money I spent to come here? Your guard here is completely ruining my vacation photos." Sarah maintained her professional smile. "I understand you'd like to take photos, ma'am. However, the barriers are here for everyone's safety, including yours. We have designated photo areas just over there." She pointed to a spot where other tourists were happily taking pictures. But Patricia wasn't interested in following directions. She pulled out a stack of papers from her bag. "Look at this. This is my luxury vacation package. It costs more than your monthly salary." She waved the papers in Sarah's face, causing several nearby children to stare wide-eyed at her behavior. Private Matthews continued to stand perfectly still, but his training was being tested. In his mind, he was remembering the words of his commanding officer: "No matter what happens, maintain your composure. You represent centuries of tradition." The situation got even more tense when Patricia pulled out her phone and started a video. "I'm going live on Facebook right now," she announced to everyone. "I'm going to show all my followers how badly tourists are treated at Buckingham Palace." Sarah tried one more time to calm things down. "Ma'am, if you'd like, I can take a photo of you from the approved area. It will actually look better from there because of the angle." "Don't tell me about angles," Patricia snapped. "I have 10,000 followers on Instagram. I know everything about taking perfect photos." This wasn't true. She actually had 147 followers, mostly family members and real estate clients. More palace security guards were starting to notice the commotion. Two of them began walking slowly toward the scene, speaking quietly into their radios. They had seen situations like this before and knew they needed to be prepared for anything. Private Matthews noticed them too, but he kept his eyes straight ahead, just as his training required. He could see Patricia getting more agitated in his peripheral vision, but he didn't move a muscle. His stillness seemed to make Patricia even angrier. "Why won't you even look at me?" she demanded, stepping closer to the guard. "This is horrible customer service. In America, people in uniforms respect paying customers." The crowd had grown even larger now. Some people were shaking their heads in disapproval, while others couldn't look away from the scene unfolding before them. A group of school children on a field trip watched with fascination as their teacher tried to use this as a lesson in how not to behave. Sarah made one final attempt to defuse the situation. "Ma'am, please step back, or we'll have to ask you to leave the premises." Her voice was firmer now, showing that patience was running out. Patricia's response was to take another step forward, now clearly over the barrier. She raised her phone higher, trying to get a selfie with Private Matthews in the background. The security guards began moving faster toward her, and the crowd tensed up, knowing they were about to witness something unprecedented at the gates of Buckingham Palace. The next few moments at Buckingham Palace seemed to move in slow motion. Patricia Winters, still holding her phone high in the air, had crossed the barrier for the third time. The security guards were only a few steps away now, but what happened next would shock everyone present. "I paid good money to be here." Patricia's voice echoed across the courtyard. Her designer handbag swung wildly as she gestured with her arms. "This is going in my official complaint to the Queen." Of course, she didn't know that Queen Elizabeth had passed away, and King Charles was now the monarch. She hadn't bothered to research anything about modern British royalty before her trip. The growing crowd of onlookers had formed a perfect circle around the scene. Phones were raised everywhere, recording every second. A British teenager whispered to his friend, "This is going to go viral." He was more right than he knew. Sarah Thompson, the palace staff member, made one last attempt to control the situation. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Please step back behind the barrier immediately." Her voice was calm but firm, like a teacher dealing with a difficult student. But Patricia was too far gone in her anger to listen to reason. She turned to the crowd, playing to her audience. "Can you believe this treatment?" she asked loudly. I'm going to call the American Embassy. This is discrimination against Americans." An elderly British woman in the crowd couldn't hold back anymore. "Oh, do shut up, dear," she said clearly. "You're embarrassing yourself and your country." This comment made several people chuckle, which only made Patricia more furious. Private Matthews remained perfectly still, but his training was being severely tested. In his 2 years as a royal guard, he had seen tourists make funny faces, try to make him laugh, and even dance in front of him, but no one had ever been this aggressive. Patricia's face was now almost as red as the guard's uniform. She was sweating despite the cool morning air, and her perfectly styled hair was starting to fall out of place. Her expensive makeup was smearing as she wiped angry sweat from her face. "Do you know what I'm going to do?" she announced to everyone. "I'm going to write a 1-star review on TripAdvisor. I'm going to post this on every social media platform. The whole world will see how terrible this place is." The security guards were now close enough to intervene, but they wanted to give her one last chance to calm down. They had dealt with angry tourists before, and sometimes people came to their senses at the last moment. But Patricia wasn't done yet. She turned back to Private Matthews, who stood as still as a statue. "Hey, Mr. Guard, I'm talking to you." She waved her hand in front of his face, her long acrylic nails flashing in the sunlight. A young girl in the crowd pulled on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, why is that lady so angry?" she asked innocently. "Because some people never learn good manners, sweetheart," her mother replied, loud enough for Patricia to hear. This comment seemed to push Patricia even closer to the edge. She turned to glare at the mother and daughter, momentarily distracted from her target. The security guards saw this as their chance to move in, but they weren't quite fast enough. When Patricia turned back to Private Matthews, something in her snapped. The fact that he continued to ignore her, standing there in his perfect uniform, doing his job exactly as he was supposed to, made her lose the last bit of control she had. "You can't ignore me," she screamed, her voice hitting a pitch that made people wince. "I'm an important person. Look at me when I'm talking to you." The crowd could sense that something big was about to happen. Some people took a step back, while others pressed record on their phones, making sure they wouldn't miss whatever was coming next. Sarah Thompson was now reaching for her radio to call for additional backup. The 2 security guards quickened their pace, but they were all about to be too late to prevent what would become one of the most shocking moments ever recorded at Buckingham Palace's gates. What happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media platforms across the world. In just a few seconds, Patricia Winters would transform from an angry tourist into an international symbol of entitled behavior, and her actions would have consequences she never expected. Time seemed to slow down as Patricia took one final step toward Private Matthews. Her designer shoes clicked against the pavement, and her expensive bracelet jingled as she raised her hand. The crowd collectively held their breath, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. I said, "Look at me." Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with rage. The veins in her neck were visible now, and her carefully applied makeup was streaking down her face from sweat and anger. Private Matthews saw what was coming. His military training had prepared him for many situations, but this was different. He could have moved. He could have blocked her. He could have stepped aside. But his duty and training required him to maintain his position, no matter what. The sound of the slap echoed across the courtyard like a crack of thunder. Patricia's manicured hand made contact with Private Matthews' face with such force that her own palm turned bright red. The sound was so sharp and sudden that several people in the crowd gasped. A flock of pigeons took flight from a nearby roof, startled by the noise and the crowd's reaction. For a split second, everything went completely silent. Even the usual sounds of London traffic seemed to fade away. The hundreds of phones recording the incident captured this moment perfectly. The shocked faces in the crowd, the frozen stance of the security guards, and most importantly, the absolutely professional stillness of Private Matthews. The guard didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His training held firm, even though a red mark was already forming on his cheek where Patricia's hand had struck him. Patricia stood there, her hand still raised, a look of triumph on her face that would soon turn to regret. She actually smiled, believing she had somehow won this confrontation. "Now you'll pay attention to me," she declared loudly. The crowd's silence lasted only seconds before chaos erupted. People were shouting, pointing, and some were even crying. The young girl who had asked about Patricia's behavior earlier buried her face in her mother's coat. The elderly British woman who had told Patricia to shut up earlier was now on her phone, apparently calling the police herself. "Did you see that? She actually hit him. Someone arrest her. She's mad. Call the police." The voices merged into a wave of outrage. Sarah Thompson, the palace staff member, was already speaking rapidly into her radio. Code red at Gate 3. Immediate assistance required. Physical assault on a royal guard. Repeat. Physical assault on a royal guard. The security guards who had been approaching were now running. Their shoes pounded against the pavement as they closed the distance. But they weren't the only ones responding to the situation. From seemingly nowhere, additional palace security personnel appeared. They moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed plan, quickly surrounding the area. Their black uniforms and earpieces made them look like something out of a movie, but this was very real. Patricia's triumphant smile began to fade as she realized what was happening. The gravity of what she had just done started to sink in. She looked around at the circle of security personnel closing in on her, and for the first time that morning, fear replaced anger in her eyes. "Wait," she said, her voice suddenly much smaller. "You don't understand. He was ignoring me. He was being rude to me. I want to speak to someone in charge." But it was too late for complaints or demands now. The phones in the crowd were still recording as Patricia's expression changed from satisfaction to confusion to growing panic. She looked around frantically, perhaps finally understanding that she had just committed a serious crime on camera in front of hundreds of witnesses. Private Matthews remained at his post, as still as ever, the red mark on his cheek the only evidence of what had just occurred. His discipline in this moment would later be praised by his superiors and admired by millions online. But right now, all eyes were on Patricia, as she was about to learn exactly what happens when someone assaults a member of the Queen's Guard. The next few minutes at Buckingham Palace moved with military precision. Palace security had trained for all kinds of situations, and while a tourist slapping a royal guard wasn't common, the response was quick and professional. "Step away from the guard immediately," a tall security officer commanded Patricia. His voice was firm and left no room for argument. Patricia, however, still hadn't realized how serious the situation was. "But I need to explain," she protested, trying to maintain her earlier confidence. She reached for her phone, which she had dropped during the slap. "I have it all on video." He was being completely unreasonable. "Ma'am, do not move," another security officer ordered. She was a woman named Officer Chen, who had dealt with difficult tourists before, but never one who had physically attacked a guard. "Place your hands where we can see them." The crowd had grown even larger now. People who had been walking past the palace stopped to watch the scene unfold. Some were still recording, while others were already uploading their videos to social media. In London's busy tourist area, news traveled fast. Patricia's designer handbag slipped from her shoulder as she looked around frantically. Her expensive sunglasses fell to the ground, but nobody moved to pick them up. "Don't you know who I am?" She tried again, but her voice was shaking now. "I'm an American citizen. You can't treat me like this." Officer Chen stepped closer. "Ma'am, you have just assaulted a member of His Majesty's Royal Guard. This is a serious criminal offense. Please place your hands behind your back." Finally, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Patricia's face, which had been red with anger just minutes ago, now turned pale. She looked at the guard she had slapped, perhaps hoping he would speak up in her defense. But Private Matthews remained perfectly still at his post, the red mark on his cheek now clearly visible. I didn't mean to." Patricia's voice was barely a whisper now. "It was just a little slap. I was frustrated. Surely we can work this out?" But there would be no working it out. 2 Metropolitan Police officers had already arrived, their blue uniforms standing out among the palace security's black uniforms. They had been nearby and responded to the emergency call within minutes. "This is ridiculous." Patricia tried one last time. "I want to call the American embassy. I have rights. I know important people back home." The police officers weren't impressed. One of them, Sergeant Williams, took out his handcuffs. "Patricia Winters," he said formally, "you are under arrest for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." Anything you do say may be given in evidence. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Patricia finally broke down. Tears streaked through her expensive makeup, leaving dark trails down her cheeks. Her perfectly styled hair had fallen completely out of place, and her designer outfit was wrinkled from her struggles. "My phone," she cried out. "My bag. I need to call my husband." "Your belongings will be logged as evidence," Officer Chen explained calmly. "You'll be allowed to make calls from the station." The crowd watched in silence as Patricia was led away. Her designer shoes, which had seemed so perfect for photos just an hour ago, now made it difficult for her to walk properly in handcuffs. She stumbled slightly, and the officers had to help her stay upright. Sarah Thompson, the palace staff member who had tried to warn Patricia earlier, began dispersing the crowd. "Show's over, folks," she announced. "Please return to the designated viewing areas." But the show wasn't really over. Even as Patricia was being placed in the back of a police car, videos of her slapping the royal guard were already going viral. News websites were picking up the story, and social media was exploding with comments and shares. Private Matthews remained at his post, as still as ever. Another guard would soon come to relieve him, and only then would he be able to give his official statement about the incident. For now, he continued his duty, exactly as his training required, while Patricia's cries could still be heard from the police car. The Charing Cross police station was having an unusually busy morning. Officers and staff kept glancing at the woman sitting in the interview room, the American tourist who had done the unthinkable by slapping a royal guard. Patricia Winters didn't look so confident anymore. Her designer clothes were wrinkled from sitting in the police car and then the holding cell. Her makeup was completely ruined from crying, and her highlighted hair hung limply around her face. The handcuffs had been removed, but she kept rubbing her wrists where they had been. "Mrs. Winters," Detective Sarah Mitchell began, placing a folder on the table between them. "Do you understand why you're here?" She spoke clearly and professionally, making notes as she talked. Patricia sniffed loudly. "This is all a huge misunderstanding," she said, trying to sound like the important person she thought she was back home. "I just got a little upset. In America, we have freedom of expression." Detective Mitchell opened her folder, revealing printed screenshots from various social media platforms. "Mrs. Winters, we have over 300 videos of you assaulting a member of His Majesty's Royal Guard. This is not about freedom of expression." For the first time, Patricia saw some of the headlines on social media. Entitled "Karen Attacks Royal Guard." "American Tourist's Royal Meltdown Goes Viral." "Palace Assault." "Florida Woman Faces Serious Charges." Her face went pale as Detective Mitchell continued laying out photos and statements. "The assault was witnessed by hundreds of people. The Royal Guard you struck. Private James Matthews has given his statement. The palace staff tried to warn you multiple times." But, Patricia stammered. "I spent so much money on this trip. That guard was ignoring me. I just wanted a good photo for my social media." In another room of the police station, Patricia's husband Tom was frantically trying to arrange things over the phone. He had been enjoying a golf game back in Florida when he got the call about his wife's arrest. "What do you mean? She slapped a royal guard?" He had shouted into his phone earlier. Now he was talking to their lawyer, trying to figure out how serious this was. The answer wasn't good. Back in the interview room, Detective Mitchell was explaining the charges. "Mrs. Winters, you're being charged with assault on a protected officer, disorderly conduct, and trespassing on royal property. These are serious offenses." Patricia's eyes widened. "Protected officer? I thought he was just a guard in a funny hat, like those people who pose for photos in Hollywood." "The Queen's Guard are active-duty military personnel," Detective Mitchell explained patiently. "Assaulting them is like assaulting a police officer or military service member. It's a serious crime in the United Kingdom." Just then, there was a knock on the door. Another officer entered with a tablet, showing Detective Mitchell something. Patricia could hear whispers about millions of views and trending worldwide. "Mrs. Winters," Detective Mitchell continued, "your actions have now been viewed by millions of people online. The U.S. Embassy has been notified, but they've made it clear that they cannot intervene in a criminal matter." Patricia's face crumpled. "But what about my job? My clients? My social media followers?" She had been so proud of her 147 Instagram followers back home, but now she was trending worldwide for all the wrong reasons. "That's not our concern," Detective Mitchell replied firmly. "Right now, you need to focus on the legal consequences of your actions. You'll be held until your court appearance tomorrow morning." Patricia burst into fresh tears. "Can't I just pay a fine and go home? I'll write an apology letter. I'll delete the videos." "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Detective Mitchell said. "Assaulting a royal guard is treated very seriously here. The videos are already public evidence, and there's also the matter of your visa status." Those words made Patricia freeze. "My visa status?" Detective Mitchell nodded gravely. "Any criminal conviction could affect your ability to travel internationally in the future. You could be banned from entering the United Kingdom again." As these words sank in, Patricia finally understood the full impact of her actions. Her expensive vacation had turned into a nightmare, and her moment of entitlement was about to cost her far more than the price of her luxury travel package. 1 month had passed since the infamous Royal Guard slap incident, and Patricia Winter's life had changed completely. Back in her Florida home, she sat in her dark living room, staring at her phone, something she once loved doing but now dreaded. The court case had been quick but expensive. Her husband Tom had to pay £5,000 in fines, about $6,300, plus all the legal fees. The judge had given her a 6-month suspended sentence, which meant she wouldn't go to jail if she stayed out of trouble. But that wasn't the worst part. Patricia was now banned from entering the United Kingdom for 10 years. Her passport had a special note about her conviction, which made traveling to any country more difficult. Her dream of becoming an international luxury real estate agent was over before that even started. The viral videos of her slapping Private Matthews had reached over 50 million views across different social media platforms. People had made memes, remixes, and parody videos of her meltdown. Late-night TV hosts had joked about her, and news channels had used her as an example of entitled tourist behavior. Local realtor's Royal Guard attack goes viral, a cautionary tale of entitlement. That was the headline in their local newspaper. Her real estate agency had politely asked her to resign. They couldn't have their brand associated with someone who had become an international symbol of bad behavior. Her social media accounts, which she had been so proud of, were now flooded with negative comments. She had to make everything private and change her name on all platforms. Some people had even found her real estate listings and left fake reviews about her properties. "I just got off the phone with another potential client," Tom said, walking into the living room. "They recognized your name and decided to go with a different agent." He sighed heavily, thinking about all the money this incident had cost them. Meanwhile, in London, Private James Matthews had become something of a hero. His perfect composure during the assault had earned him a commendation from his commanding officer. New Royal Guards were now shown the video during their training as an example of perfect discipline under pressure. The spot where Patricia had stood was now famous. Tour guides pointed it out to visitors. And this is where the infamous American tourist slapped a royal guard in 2025. Tourists would take selfies there, but always behind the barrier, not wanting to become another Patricia. Back in Florida, Patricia's phone buzzed with a news alert. She almost didn't look at it, but something made her check. It was a new article about her incident, but this one was different. It was about how tourist sites around the world were using her video to train their staff about dealing with difficult visitors. "The palace incident changed our approach to tourist management," a Buckingham Palace spokesperson was quoted in the article. "We've installed better barriers and additional signs in multiple languages. Sometimes it takes an unfortunate incident to improve our systems." Patricia's neighbor Susan, who used to envy her expensive vacations and designer clothes, now barely spoke to her. The neighborhood Facebook group had removed Patricia as an admin. Her book club had suddenly become too full for new members when she tried to join. "Maybe we should move," Patricia said to Tom. "Start fresh somewhere else." But Tom shook his head. "The internet never forgets, Pat. We just have to wait for this to blow over." He didn't mention that their savings had been drained by the legal fees and lost business. The only positive thing that had come from this whole mess was that Patricia had changed. The experience had taught her humility, something she had badly needed. She started volunteering at a local tourist information center, helping visitors to Florida understand local customs and rules. "You know what the funny thing is?" She said to Tom one evening. If I had just stayed behind the barrier and been polite, I would have gotten a much better photo with the guard, and I would still be able to travel to Europe. Private Matthews continued his duties at Buckingham Palace, occasionally nodding slightly when tourists thanked him for his service. The red mark on his cheek had faded long ago, but the lesson he helped teach about respecting rules and other cultures would last much longer. And so, Patricia's moment of entitlement became a lasting reminder to tourists everywhere. No photo is worth breaking rules or disrespecting those who enforce them. Her expensive vacation had turned into an expensive lesson, one that she would never forget, and one that the internet would remember for years to come.